Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Diebel. I am the chair of the East Lyme Democratic Town Committee, and I'm very pleased to have you all with us here tonight. I'm going to welcome in a few friends to talk a little bit about what cannabis equity can mean for our town, East Lyme. We are living in historic times, as you all are well aware, and some really exciting developments are happening in many aspects of our culture and society. And I happen to believe that cannabis equity and cannabis legalization is some of the most exciting and exciting growth opportunities for our little corner of the country. And I'm very pleased today that we're going to have this conversation with a good friend of mine, Mr. Jason Ortiz from Cure, Connecticut, who is going to speak with another one of my very good friends, Ms. Kate Steele, about what the future for this industry could look like in our little part of the state. Once again, I am recording this, so if you have issues with being on camera, please turn your camera off. And I'm going to ask you to mute your mics for the time being while we get underway here. Eventually, we're definitely going to open this up to questions and answers, a Q&A session for Mr. Jason Ortiz over here. He has asked specifically to have a Q&A session because his leadership in Cure is seeking input from communities like ours. To find out what we're interested in, what we want to know more about, what we're curious about. And if you're like me, you've got lots of questions and we definitely want to hear them. So I don't have too much more to say besides the fact that we do one of these conversations every other month or so. We've actually run 3 months in a row, or 2 months in a row now, and we have another one coming up on April 22nd. The idea of these conversations is to take a core tenet of the Democratic Party platform and explore how it manifests in our local communities. And so far they've been really successful, and I appreciate everyone who's been a part of that. And I'm really looking forward to this one. So I'm just going to put a plug in for next month. Come by at April 22nd. We'll see Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld talk about the environment, land conservation, and water, which I am a big fan of. I'm sure you are also. But not to steal the spotlight away from Mr. Jason Ortiz, I'm going to pass the mic over now to Kate Steele and Jason Ortiz. I welcome you both. Have at it, my friends.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason. And so glad, Jason Ortiz, to be able to see you again. Great smile and wonderful opportunity for us to be together. So Jason, first question, what is your history? Why is this such a topic of high interest for you?
So I first got introduced to the cannabis justice movement when I was arrested in high school for possession. And so I grew up in Norwich, Connecticut. I was actually born in New London, but grew up in Norwich. And when I was at NFA in 10th grade, I was caught smoking on the way to school, and the police actually kind of corralled us as soon as we got onto campus. It was my first experience ever dealing like that directly with police. And, you know, at first I didn't really understand why folks were so angry with me, because they were very aggressive and physically aggressive with me about bringing me to get in trouble and bringing me down to the police station. And, you know, it definitely illuminated to me exactly just how traumatic like interaction with the criminal justice system could be. And I can tell you, after feeling handcuffs on my wrist, like actually having chains put on me, it changed me after that. And so unfortunately I did get expelled from school for that year while I was in high school. I also had to go to the Norwich Superior Court maybe 15 different times and pay upwards of $10,000 in legal fees to avoid incarceration. And so I did not get incarcerated, just to be very clear. I was arrested and then used up youthful offender and accelerated rehabilitation to avoid jail time. That being said, while I was suspended from school, I did not have access to my friends. I didn't have access to my teachers. And so during that time, I, you know, was very angry about what happened, but also very curious about the laws and the way the laws worked and why society, or at least this community, felt so strongly about this particular issue. Because I read through the Student Code of Conduct and I noticed that for every other offense a student can possibly do, the punishment ranged from 1 to 3 days suspension, including possession of alcohol, including fighting. But for cannabis, it was first offense 45 days, suspension, and second offense, permanent expulsion. And so for me, that was the rest of the school year because it doesn't count vacation days or snow days. Every day that happened, it pushed it all the way back. And so in that process, though, I had the internet and I was able to look up some different things. And I learned 3 very particular terms that are important for everyone to understand: the war on drugs, the school to prison pipeline, and selective enforcement. And so the first 2 have some knowledge in society. If you Google either of those first terms, the war on drugs or the school to prison pipeline, we got lots of information. But it was selective enforcement that really changed how I looked at the way law operates in society. And I learned that some laws are enforced more in certain communities than they are in others. And in Norwich, communities of color were one of the communities that were more likely to get arrested for cannabis. So were young people specifically. And so it really changed my idea that the societal structures around me were there to help me and support me, and realized that no, some of them are definitely there to disrupt my life and disrupt my community. So from there, I became a cannabis activist. I didn't want anyone else to have to go through that. Even at the time, I didn't fully understand why it was happening, but I knew that I wasn't the only one that had been arrested, and I definitely wasn't the only person of color that got in trouble for cannabis in high school. And it was a pretty diverse high school, relatively speaking, but it was still very apparent. And so I did eventually graduate from high school, made it to go to the University of Connecticut. And while I was at UConn, I joined an organization called Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And that organization helped me understand that there are very specific laws that affect all different parts of society, and small tweaks to laws can have a big impact. One example of that was there was a law that would deny students financial aid for any kind of drug infraction or arrest called the Higher Education Act's Federal Aid Elimination Penalty. And it's a long title for basically, if you got in trouble, no financial aid for you. And what had happened was that SSDP and other drug policy expert or advocates between 2000 and 2008 got a slight tweak to that law that said you only lost financial aid if you got caught while you were on financial aid. So that meant anyone that was in high school now could access financial aid. So I was not only the victim of the war on drugs and negatively impacted by the laws, but it was also positively impacted by the activism around it. And that I was able to go to UConn and able to join SSDP because people fought really hard for even small changes. And so from there, you know, I became very focused on policy, very much looking at the very specific details of who implemented what and how things are going to move forward. And from there, my, you know, endeavor to the broader criminal justice, cannabis justice, and drug policy movement became a part of my life ever since then.
So if we can back up a little bit, Jason, I'm really interested in finding out, you're obviously bright. Were you a good student? Were you like an A honor student, A, B student? Where were you in the
Yeah, that depended on the type of education I was in at the time. And so I was lucky enough to go to the Integrated Day Charter School, and Mrs. Heffernan, who was the principal and 5th and 6th grade teacher of the school at the time, was fantastic. I would not say I was very well behaved. There was no part in my life where I was very well behaved. However, in elementary school to 6th grade, I wasn't like criminalized or penalized as severely as when I went to Kelly Middle School, which was 7th and 8th grade, and then NFA. There was a stark shift for me where in Integrated Day I could move around, I could find my projects that I wanted to work on, I could kind of determine my schedule. But when I had to go to a traditional classroom and sit in a desk and not move and not talk, that was very difficult for me. But I was always the person that got in trouble for arguing about the rules. Like I didn't really get in fights. I didn't like steal stuff. It was like, you're going to get a detention for doing something. I said, I don't think that's a valid like reason to get me in trouble. And they would say, well, you don't go to detention. You have to go to Saturday school. I'm like, I'm not doing that either. And so eventually I would get suspended and, it would escalate. And so
you're a little bit of a rebel, if I'm understanding things correctly. You had, a good brain, good thinking, good criteria, always asking
one
questions.
That would get a 4 or 5 on my AP test and then be suspended the next week.
Right. So I'm understanding the kind of student that you were, and perhaps I'm thinking that to some extent you were kind of using marijuana as a means to kind of slow yourself down a little bit, to calm yourself, so that in the situation you can tolerate maybe the teachers that weren't as bright as you and helping you. Right?
I would say that's more true in college. When I was younger, I didn't really start using cannabis like repeatedly until I was 16. And so I had tried it before that, but it wasn't, I would say until about 10th grade and I was 16 that I started to use it more frequently. And I would say though that it absolutely did help me with my anger issues. It didn't help me with necessarily my disdain for authority figures, but the explosive elements of those interactions did get less and less and less over time, without a doubt. But I didn't see that maybe play itself out until I was a little bit older, because
that's kind of the thing that takes perspective. I think as you age, then you can look back and see that kind of thing. And your last name is Ortiz, so I'm guessing that there might be a little bit of Spanish or Latina.
Puerto Rican, 100% Puerto Rican.
Okay, there you go. Love it. Okay, well, so and they were identifying you as different, perhaps. Were you Spanish speaking?
Oh yeah, I had blue hair for a long time too. Like I was known as the troublemaker even before the cannabis part became a part of it. But it was also, again, I was the person that did really well on tests, and I just couldn't sit still, right? Like I just couldn't sit there and do nothing while other folks were just kind of waiting, right? That was
or whatever. And I guess that's probably true today.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've been sitting in front of a lot of Zoom meetings lately, but yes, I do have to make sure that I, stay focused, right? But I would say it has definitely, over time now, I can focus the energy better than I would before. Then I probably didn't know exactly how to utilize that type of energy, where now I consider it an asset.
Okay, great. So good start. So we're talking about cannabis. And so what is the difference between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana, just so that everybody who's listening to this can kind of delineate and clarify the two different positions?
So they're different legal structures is really the big difference. I mean, the plant itself is the same plant. The type of plant of cannabis is both hemp and medical marijuana and recreational. It's all cannabis. There are different strains or cultivars of each one that have different types of chemicals and cannabinoids produced. In a similar way, we have red apples and green apples and yellow apples. The same thing with cannabis. There's lots of different kinds, and some of them have been bred specifically for a particular purpose, right? And so hemp is one of those. It has been bred to remove the THC, and it is bred to emphasize the fiber and the use of it as a construction material or for fuel, where medical marijuana is going to be specifically cultivated to address a particular ailment. And so because the cannabis plant has over 60 cannabinoids and hundreds of other chemicals in it, including terpenes, those different combinations will have different effects on a person's body. So to back up a little bit as far as the science of THC and cannabis, all of our bodies have an endocannabinoid system as part of our bodies the day we're born and until the day we die. That is just a natural part of being a human. And that endocannabinoid system's purpose is to regulate homeostasis. And so homeostasis is your body being at rest and being, feeling okay, right? It's warm enough, it's full enough, it feels safe. And so regulating homeostasis is different for each individual person. If a particular person is running, a deficiency in a particular chemical, they're gonna have a different homeostasis than somebody else will. So that is why cannabis affects everyone differently, because everyone is going into that interaction with cannabis with a different physiological makeup. What medical cannabis does is try to hone in very specifically on your particular genetic situation or your particular ailment and find the right plant that balances that situation the best, which is why it's very different if somebody is having a mental health issue versus if they're going through cancer or if they're having to deal with, say, physical recuperation from sports, right? All of those situations can benefit from cannabinoid therapy, but they're very different plants and very different medicines for each one. And if somebody takes the wrong medicine, they get a really bad interaction with that, right? Just like you could in any kind of pharmaceutical medicine, it's the same thing. But at the core of it, it's all the same plant. It's just what are we asking that particular version of the plant to produce for us for our end goal. When it comes to recreational cannabis, there is less specificity, right, as far as what the person is looking for, and it is more just choice and, personal opinion and perspective. And so I think it's important that medical cannabis is the same plant, but in usually, depending on the type of ailment, higher doses, right? Just like I may be able to get through the day with a simple aspirin, other folks may need much stronger painkillers to get through the day. They would access those types of cannabis in a different level of security, just like it's harder to get oxycodone or Oxycontin than it is ibuprofen. And so it's not that it's all that different of a plant, it's just how we apply the plant or what we're trying to achieve with the plant that's different. And then of course the legal ramifications are quite different, right? The hemp plant version of cannabis is federally legal through the Farm Act that recently passed. Medical marijuana here in Connecticut is legal for some people, for some ailments, and recreational cannabis is not yet legal here in Connecticut, but it is in 13 states across the country.
Right. So there are 13 states. And what are some lessons that we can learn from our states? Massachusetts is our neighbor to the north, and they have legalized it. So what is your perspective, and what do you think we can glean from their experience?
So Massachusetts was done by ballot measure. And so there is always that piece of this that we have to understand that Connecticut just doesn't have that option to be able to run things through ballot measure. It has to go through the legislature. So what Massachusetts had going for them is they could go to the public and say, this is what we want. Does the public support it, right? We can't do that in Connecticut. So we have to make the case through moral, convincing arguments, through economic arguments, through financial arguments. So in order to pass this, we need 76 votes in the House to get it out of the House. And what goes in the bill is going to determine who of which Democrats are going to be those 76, right? So one thing I learned from Massachusetts was you have to include some of the real basic ideas behind criminal justice reform, community investment, and ownership and licensing, or the public is not going to support the implementation of it. And so Massachusetts did put an emphasis on equity. They did do their best to make sure that licenses came out. However, the number one thing I would say I learned from Massachusetts is that the timeline of who gets to go first, which laws are implemented in what order, determines the success of the entire program. If you put all of the big companies going first, they will own the entire industry moving forward, and your illicit market or legacy market, or what some folks call the black market, will continue to thrive. If you instead put those folks as potential entrepreneurs and empower them to become legal entrepreneurs and let the big guys figure it out on their own, you're much more likely to address issues around the black market. And where Massachusetts included things like home grow, for example, that also is part of the decriminalization aspect of this, that if folks don't feel like legalization is real, they're just going to continue to do what they were already doing. And so you have to include robust measures as far as criminal justice reform, community investment, and ownership and licensing that we call equity programs in order to get buy-in from the public. And we're seeing in places that didn't do that, they're having a lot of issues moving forward.
So what do you think some of the issues are and concerns that you would have as far as legalizing recreational marijuana?
Well, the question is not around what are the concerns with legalizing it, it's how we legalize it. I think we've gotten to a point now where the public and even a lot of Republicans, understand this is coming, it's happening all around us, and it is something that is in front of us that we have to do correctly. What I'm concerned with is that financial interests will hijack this opportunity to further double down on corporate rule of all of the small businesses in America, right? And so we have an opportunity here to do it right, and we have the talent and the perspective and the people in the state to do it right. And the concern is, will we be able to beat the big money interests that want to own the entire industry? And this is, again, where we start talking about licensing and ownership. If you do that, patients will not be able to access the right kind of medicine that they need. Folks that are in the illicit market are going to continue to do what they want to do. You're not going to see the revenue totals that we want to see. And there's just going to be a higher price for everybody when it comes to cannabis. And very few people will benefit from that. Here in Connecticut, we have 4 major growers/cultivators. They own 100% of the market. And so it's already a rather small cartel owning the market. One of those is a Russian billionaire that doesn't even live in the United States. One of those is owned by the Jim Beam family of big alcohol fame. Another one was their plant that used to be the one locally owned that just got bought out by a Hooters franchisee. And then lastly, we have CT Pharma, which is owned by former Republican Governor Mike Fidel, and their security director is the Harford County DEA agent. And he's also a part-time mayor of Berlin, Connecticut, and he's opposed to legalization. So when we're talking about who is going to be able to sell cannabis and who won't be able to sell cannabis, by giving it directly to these folks, only those 4 entities will be allowed to grow even one plant. Everybody else will still go to jail. It'll still be illegal for that for us to sell any type of cannabis. And this is under what the current governor's plan is, SB 888. That's his approach, where our approach is very different, right? And so right now, again, I work with MCBA, Minority Cannabis Business Association, and also CURE-CT, which is Connecticut United for Reform and Equity. And we are supporting a different approach done by Representative Robin Porter, HB 6377, that centers equity applicants, as we call them, which are individuals that have been negatively impacted by the war on drugs through arrest or incarceration, and they get first dibs on the licenses that would start the industry. So we put them first. We include our labor unions in what we like to call a path to prosperity. That is a jobs training program, an apprenticeship program through the unions with UFCW for those with an adverse criminal history. So anyone that got arrested or, incarcerated, they can get trained in real serious, building trades types of positions. And, I think when we start to bring all of the different entities that can benefit to the table, we see all the different ways that legalization can help all of our different communities, right? Whereas if we do it very narrowly and only let a certain number of people own the whole thing, our communities are going to be locked out forever. And that is quite frankly unacceptable to me and to the other folks that are fighting for legalization, that we have to center the idea that the war on drugs was done in a racist manner with racist impacts, and it's not even up for debate anymore. Even the folks in the Nixon administration admitted that. And so now we have to be healing the damage done. The state of Connecticut, right? The government of Connecticut arrested and incarcerated people of color. They destroyed families. They ripped kids from their homes. They put them in foster care because of a plant. They had patients that had to call 911 because they were hurt. They took their house away because they had a plant in it. And so there was all this damage done. And now folks want to talk about it as if, well, there's only one way to move forward, and it's the corporate way, right? And well, no, first we have to address what actually happened and why it happened and who designed the policy to do that, and create new policies to undo that damage, just as if we were, trying to address a community that had gone through a very traumatic event or war. We would look at what happened to that community. We would address and quantify the damage done, and we would invest resources to heal that and get those folks back on board. And so I think my major concern is not so much that legalization will or won't happen, is that we will hijack the suffering of communities of color in order to make money for major corporations and with folks that don't even live in Connecticut.
So it sounds like there needs to be some communication going around this whole topic and helping people to understand and to kind of help to disseminate information. So what kind of campaign would you move forward with as far as helping to help people access better information?
Well, I think that, you can go to curect.nationbuilder.com right now, and that we have a lot of videos on there that explain the details between the two policies. And you can look at some of the interviews there that really go into detail. Also, Students for Sensible Drug Policy and minoritycannabis.org, both have tremendous information. But I think you have to really look at your own communities and assess what has happened over the last 30 years in regards to drugs. And cannabis specifically. And I think the more that we're grounding our understanding of the war on drugs by its literal impact and where we live, the easier all of it is going to be to understand. Because even if you don't have a particular community of color, say in East Lyme or different places that it's like very clearly over-policed, there's going to be class issues. I guarantee you that if you look at in any community, the people that were arrested were poorer than the average person in that community. And so I want to make sure that as folks look at this, this isn't an issue that happens to outside places. The war on drugs has happened everywhere in the state of Connecticut. The reason that we have such stigma attached to folks that were dealing with opiate addiction is because of the war on drugs. And so we as a society both have to educate ourselves, and there's lots of information out there. YouTube is always going to be your best friend as far as like understanding really complex topics, because there's just infinite amounts of information. But really look internally as how you grew up. Were there communities that you felt like the police were harassing them more than others? Did you have any experiences where you felt like something just seemed a little unfair, right? And start to analyze, why did those laws get made? And chances are there's two big reasons why these laws are made: money and fear, right? And both of those don't lead to effective public policy. Sometimes it's about, we want to keep jobs in something like the criminal justice sector or prison or something to that nature, or folks are just very afraid of a plant that they don't really understand, and then put in policies to penalize folks criminally for something that is really about their own insecurities on the topic. And so the more that we can find the laws that were generated either about money or fear and undo them and replace them with laws that are grounded in our values and equity, we will start to undo it in our own communities. And I think that's what I really would like everyone to do. Think about where you grew up, think about your current community here in Connecticut. How does the war on drugs impact it there? And I know we've all dealt with folks that have had addiction issues, lack of resources to mental health treatment, right? There are a lot of reasons for those situations, but a big one is the war on drugs. And the faster we can end it, the faster we can get resources for folks that need it. And I think the last piece of it is we have to have our state reps and our state senators and our governor talking about this as a priority. Right now, they don't see it as a priority. And we cannot allow, more years, more arrests, more families destroyed just because people don't want to talk about it or they're afraid to dig into the details, right? Like, this is the year we need to get it done. And it will benefit everyone if we do. So we have to hold our reps accountable. And I know, the reps for East Lyme are not with us on this particular issue, but we have to force them to tell us what their alternative is. If you don't want to do this, how are they going to solve the problems that we're facing as a community? And I think if we can at least put the pressure on folks to address the issue, talk about it seriously, I think there will be less folks willing to stand in the way of progress.
Well, and I know that my opponent for state rep for East Lyme and Salem said that it was a gateway drug, and that was her comment. And she wasn't really even willing to come to the table to talk with people about it or to view our medical facilities and to understand it at a deeper level. How would we monitor it, Jason, I guess is the next question I would have. And I would encourage folks on, I think there's about 22, 24 participants currently. If anyone wants to type in a question, we can kind of filter through those so that the conversation will answer the questions that people are coming to the table and wanting to have answered. So I guess my question is, Jason, is it a gateway drug? I mean, what do you say to that? How would you answer that question?
No, it's not a gateway drug. What is a gateway to addictive or depressive mental states is pulling folks away from their support structure. The issue with a gateway drug is we're talking about addiction, right? When folks use the term gateway drug, they tend to be claiming that this particular substance leads folks to do more extreme substances. Now, number one, there's no science to support that it's actually true. And it is also highly likely that things like alcohol are much more a predictor of going on to other things than cannabis is. That being said, it's really about someone's mental state in whether they feel like they are supported in their community, if they're loved in their family, if they are in a safe place. It's a lack of these things that folks then end up turning to drugs, generally speaking, to fill that particular void. So this is where you can have two twins that grew up very similarly. One feels supported and the other one doesn't. The one that doesn't has a very different mental health state than the twin that was supported. So, and I know Holly Cheeseman actually testified to her at one of the judiciary hearings, or I think it was, or a general law hearing, and she, told me very clearly how she felt about this particular issue. But the reality is, right now, the drug exists, as do many drugs in society. And folks are going to explore them both for curiosity reasons as we're younger, but also, again, in order to solve mental health issues. And I think we have to decide, knowing that that is true, what is the best way to reduce the harm associated with less than adaptive drug use, right? Ways of using drugs that hurt your life and your family versus curiosity and folks that can use drugs healthily and are able to function and produce, just as much as anybody else while they consume, just like folks do if they drink a glass of wine or drink a cup of coffee in the morning. And so those are two sort of separate situations, right? Let's take the folks that use it more productively out of the equation. If we're talking about addiction and how we want to protect our youth from addiction, We have to, one, admit that part of the problem with all of this is that our youth feel disconnected from their support structures. That is at the root of all of it. But also, if students and youth are going to find these drugs, which they are, we want them to make sure that they know what they're doing and they know what they're taking. Both of those are educational approaches to how we solve issues of addiction in society. We want young people to be able to have real conversations based on science, reason, and compassion with adults that they trust, where they're really telling the truth about things. I remember when I went to DARE, they told me crack cocaine and cannabis were the same thing. Well, they're not, right? That's just not true. They're not going to affect us the same way. And when we lie to children starting out, at age 14 about drugs, we're setting up a relationship where they're not going to trust any authority figure moving forward. If the students at least know what drugs are, what they do, they can respect them and understand what their purpose is. Just like we can teach young people, we have a right to own a gun, but you don't bring that to school. You don't play with it. It's not a toy. It's not for you. It's only for adults, and it is separated in a place that's not accessible to children. And so we can teach our young people how to manage that and how to manage things like bleach in a cabinet. And so for me, it's about education. Then the second piece is making sure that folks actually know what they're taking is what they're taking, right? When it comes to street cannabis, no one really knows. It is, generally speaking, safe, though. Even corporate producers of cannabis use things like pesticides and other things we see in agriculture. But it's important that they're able to identify, is this really what I want to be taking because I want this particular effect, or is it something else? And that's going to mean real drug education for youth. And so I think if we really want to talk about addiction, one, we have to talk about the state of society that young people are growing up in that is incredibly difficult to build social ties. But also, once they're at the point where they are offered cannabis or other drugs, that they're educated enough to make a good decision on if it makes sense for them.
Absolutely, I understand. So I've read an article recently about the use of cannabis with people on the autism spectrum, people with cerebral palsy, and then people with chronic pain, that it's probably quite beneficial to them where other things haven't remedied some of the impact of their neurological condition. Are you finding that to be true also?
Yeah, again, so the cannabis plant produces a huge quantity of different cannabinoids, terpenes, and other chemicals. And so we are just now being able to experiment even like a tiny amount because of the federal ban on research. We haven't been able to actually prove any of this in a real scientific peer-reviewed study method. What we do have is anecdotal evidence of folks that were possibly dying or likely to die that when given cannabis medicine saw their effects disappear or their quality of life improve. And so we're seeing that all across the country in lots of different ways. And, without using particular names, there are some very famous cases where the strain Charlotte's Web was used for a young woman, I mean, she was like 4 or 5 years old, who had very intense seizures, and they were able to use this particular strain, and the seizures essentially went away. Not completely, right, but she was able to live her life. And so this is the thing with cannabis medicine. It may not cure your particular issue, but it improves your quality of life so that you can spend time with your family, you can go out shopping, you can do what it is that you want to do in a way that isn't in an altered state that some narcotics may leave some of our folks with. And this is particularly important for our senior citizens. Senior citizens want to be able to engage with other people and go out and see new things, but a lot of them have to take some pretty serious medication where some medications cause side effects that other medications have to fix. Cannabis heals a lot of those extra side effects on its own, and some of the side effects are very beneficial. Increased appetite, ability to sleep easier, right? Like some of these things are just helpful, generally speaking, in life. But if you're someone who's suffering from chemotherapy, if you're someone who's suffering from traumatic physical issues, this will be the difference between being able to function on your own and not. And I think it's important that we look at it not just in the extreme people are dying sense, because that definitely those people should have access to that medicine, but also in the more general sense of folks that are not in urgent situation, but could just benefit from less pain, more clarity, things like that in their lives.
Okay, sounds good. I just got a question in, Jason, about the difference between the Robbins House bill and the Senate bill.
Oh man, so yeah, there's a lot of differences there. So again, I definitely encourage folks to go to curect.nationbuilder.com, right, or is it .org? Let me just double check that here. .com, yeah, I had it right. And it has some very specific images that put them side by side that you can see where it says why this bill and the proposed language. Here are some of the big ones. Robin Porter's bill, HB 6377, includes home grow for 6 plants, and the governor's bill does not. HB 6377 creates a apprenticeship program and jobs pipeline. The governor's bill does not. Robin's bill supports our native tribes to be able to open their own cannabis businesses and interact in the state economy. The governor's bill does not. Robin's bill would also make sure that any licenses that were given out go primarily to folks that have been previously incarcerated or arrested. The governor's bill gives them all to the 5 growers. And
so this is curect.com that we should go to, Jason?
curect.nationbuilder.com.
Okay. So we can do some of that Venn diagram ourselves.
Yeah, and you'll see there's an image there. And the other piece that I also want to put, because this is important, the other thing that our bill focuses on, we address a lot of our vulnerable communities in our bill, such as students and parents. And so students often get thrown under the bus when it comes to legalization because we're still going to criminalize under 21 years old, right? That is missing the point of the war on drugs being waged primarily on our youth and it is antithetical to effective mental health policy. And so we cannot let the young people be left out of this conversation and decriminalizing for them as well. On the flip side of that is parents. I think it is underestimated how many families have been separated due to somebody having a medical emergency and the cops or EMT that comes on the scene finds cannabis or cannabis plants and take their kids away. It actually happens way more than I think most people want to admit, and we address that. It also allows for folks that have had a cannabis conviction or arrest previously to be able to adopt, which was something that was previously you're not allowed to do that. They can deny you the ability to foster a child if you have a cannabis record. And so there are a lot of these smaller pieces that I think are really important. And then the last piece is how the money gets delivered in the community investment sense. The governor's bill would like to put it into pilot funds and into the general fund, which I think is a terrible idea. That is not going to go to where it needs to go, where we actually set up a granting structure under an Office of Justice Reinvestment. And that office is staffed and tasked with advancing the cause of equity in the state. And so community, both municipal organizations, community nonprofits, individuals, other types of orgs, including a DTC, can apply to the Office of Justice Reinvestment for a project or program that they believe will advance the cause of equity, and that office decides whether or not it makes sense. So a lot of reasons why this is important. One, a lot of times when money goes into a city council or a city budget, it disappears into the longer term debt structure, right? Whereas—
So how can we make that possible, Jason? One of the questions we have is, many states have made equity in the cannabis industry a focal point. How can we really make this happen in Connecticut? And access to funding for women and minorities, so the people who perhaps suffer the most because of it. How can we equalize the structure of this?
We can get all of our reps to co-sponsor 6377 and pass it, because at its core, it does all of that. Read the bill. I think most people that actually read the language will see very clearly, what the purpose is. But we need 76 votes in the House, and we need the leadership to say that we want to push the equity-centric version of the bill. Right now, it's unclear if we have enough votes to pass legalization at all, but also it's very dependent on the details. There's a lot of Black and Puerto Rican caucus members that will not vote for a bill that doesn't have equity in it. And so we're at a bit of a tension and a power dynamic here where there may be some moderate Democrats in leadership that are trying to avoid the issue, whereas we also have very progressive members that will not allow it to move without progressive equity policies. And so it just stands still, right? And we don't want the status quo. That helps nobody, right? And so I think it's important that we support our progressive champions, but also we need to find out who still doesn't support legalization generally and get them on board, or at least address their concerns. Some of them are more genuine than others. But really what we need is 76 votes on Robin Porter's HB 6377, which is about to come out of committee in the Labor Committee. And from there, we got to bring it to a full vote. And when we look at, we have roughly 90 Democrats, we can lose about 14 Democratic votes and still pass it. And so we got to decide who are those 76 equity champions that are willing to put their name on it and push it forward.
So a question for you, Jason. Is legalization likely to pass this session? And is it just a matter of which of the two bills? I mean, there's no, I know there's no guarantees. It's potential hybrid compromise with the bills. Oftentimes that happens.
So likeliness, I don't think that's ever the best way to look at policies moving. It doesn't matter how likely or unlikely it is. We have to push for what we want every single minute until the ink is dry on the bill. And so it is always more likely the more people fight for it. So I tend to not go with what the chances are. But as far as how we can combine the bills, absolutely. However, it depends on the details of those combining, what it actually looks like at the end. And I would like to see us have Robin's bill, which is equity-centric, be the vehicle because it puts equity at the front of the conversation. As Robin likes to say, we're not going to play this. We're going to be in the back of the bus situation. We're driving the bus. And if we're not driving the bus, we're getting off the bus because it is not going in a direction that we want to go. So I want Robin's bill to be the one that gets added to. The governor has some more policies that address things like roadside testing by police and making sure that children can't access or use improper ID at dispensaries. But I think all of that language can be added to Robin's bill. So it doesn't necessarily matter which bill it really is. The policy is more important, but it does matter who is going to lead the fight all the way to the end, because that's who's going to determine where they compromise and where they don't. And I want to make sure that that person is a person of color and someone that has actually proven themselves to be able to pass policy, and Robin Porter is definitely that person.
Okay, sounds good. Jason, are you concerned that since most states have legalized through ballot format, that the Speaker of the House suggests that he would put it on a ballot for voters to decide in 2022 if he can't pass it through the legal legislature? Might it be a reality which would give hesitant legislators a way out from having to vote on the bill?
I'm concerned about it, but it would solve absolutely nothing. So, because they still do have to vote on it. So even if we were to pass a ballot measure, that ballot measure would tell the legislature, hey, Connecticut supports legalization. Immediately after that, they have to come up with regulations and policy in order to implement that ballot measure. So we're right back where we are right now. And so I don't actually think it gets us anything. It's a delay tactic. So I'm concerned they'll use it in order to do that. But I don't think it actually solves anything. It's just going to waste everybody's time. It's going to waste a lot of money to do it. And it's actually possible that in that sense, even if the public is likely to do it, it opens us up for outside money to come in and flood Connecticut with anti-cannabis propaganda, and we could lose, right? And so what happens if we lose? We're just not going to legalize forever, right? It's just it's a no-win situation with a ballot measure here in Connecticut. The public is already with us. We're already discussing the issue. Like, there's no reason to delay this. If folks want to deny our community's community investment, continue to arrest people because they don't have the courage to just vote yes or no, I just can't accept that as a legitimate public policy approach to this, right? Like, the whole reason that they're there is to vote yes or no on things. And that the Democratic Party, with roughly 90 Democrats, can't get majority to vote yes on legalization, I do not have confidence that they'll be able to run a ballot measure any better. So I think if we don't pass it now, it is unlikely we're going to pass it ever until federal comes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm wondering if there are any more questions from the participants here. I'm not seeing too many other things pop up, and I know we have people who have had a lot more experience with this than I have. So if there's any other questions that people would like to pop up. There are some people saying that it's helped elderly patients, it's changed their life with cannabis, that they were able to get off more addicting, higher addictive things like opioids and have had, more of a normal life as a result of it. Of course, there's concerns about it. And I know that there's some people who would probably like to speak to some of those concerns about, what is harmful with it and why we're so afraid of it. Is it just a fear of the unknown? I don't know, but
Okay. Hi, Jason.
I'm not seeing too.
I would love to.
If you don't mind me,
sorry, guys.
I'm going to interject by offering that if you would like to say something, we have a raise hand feature. Once we do that, like
Okay,
Mr.
good.
Warren has done, he's asked to raise his hand. I'd like to ask him to speak. I'll ask you to unmute your microphones and we'll go forward that way. So, Mr. Warren, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much, folks, for everybody for attending and being advocates in this, or at least being open to listening to this progress in our state. The most important things that I'd like to address right now are some of the things that the former speakers highlighted. And that is that being somebody who's been a cannabis advocate for many years and who's also been on high levels of opiates because of cancer and other type of other illnesses that I've had to deal with. And you know, it's the worst part is the inequity and the inability to have this medicine, which is as a patient, grow right at your house, having the ability to have some sort of material that's at your quality. And as somebody who was on opiates for a long time, I noticed that from cannabis ingestion, whether it be vaping it through like a volcano type machine or a pen, it actually reduced my opiate intakes severely. And it's uh, it's just unfortunate. It's a human right for us to be able to have access to the medicine of our choice when it's available. And this medication needs to be available and it's safe enough for people to grow at home when they take the right precautions. So that's really what I wanted to add. It is a human rights, a medical rights issue, and the legality should be pushed from those points. The Fourth Amendment protects what you do within your own property, and so these type of things, we have the alcohol precedent set with the prohibition being established in the, I believe, 18th Amendment and the repeal of prohibition in the 21st Amendment. Why isn't there that precedent used towards cannabis legalization when it's in the, in the Constitution that our medical rights should be protected, that we should have equity and justice. Anyway, thanks so much for listening, and I hope
Yes,
that
thank you,
provides.
Mr. Ward. Jason, do you have anything to contribute to that or anything that you would like to add? Because if not, we have some other hands here.
I'll just say thank you for sharing, your personal experience there when it comes to medicine. I do think it's underestimated how many folks have just simply improved their quality of life by using cannabis instead of other pharmaceutical products. And, please let your representatives know that, right? That this is not just about, it has very little to do with recreational use of the plant. Like the entire conversation really is not focused on that, and it should be focused on how we can best help patients have a higher quality of life and how we can undo the criminal justice atrocity that was the war on drugs. And I think the more we can keep it focused there, the more likely we'll be able to convince some of our detractors that now's the time to do it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Warren, for sharing your personal experience. We have a couple people that I happen to know are healthcare professionals who have their hands raised. Let's start with nurse extraordinaire Martha Marks.
Hi. Well, my question wasn't about that, but yes, I will tell you, I have so many, I did say that was my quote that Kate's read, and I said, once off opioids, they aren't constipated, which most people can't talk about constipation quite as easily as home care nurses can. But I am telling you, first of all, opioid-induced constipation is a real thing. It's awful. And my patients, I had a man who was like in the hospital for 3 years as a kid. He's 84 now. That's back in the old days where you would get in a car accident and you would have to stay in the hospital forever. And his leg is deformed. He's been in pain his whole life. 5 years ago, his kids got a medical marijuana. He has not taken oxycodone in 2 years. His life has completely changed. And I just had a man today, was on fentanyl 100 milligrams for his cancer pain. He was in so much pain. And he's on medical marijuana now. And honest to God, we had a great visit today. So that my question was, as we see now where there's always the white, most of the time males, telling people that have been discriminated against, just like with Asian women, that's happening right now in Georgia. telling them what this is what's happened to you, like them understanding the racism more than them thinking they understand it. So how is it when you go around to some of the senators and representatives, it is the people that have been affected. Like, I don't want some man telling me what it's like to have microaggressions done towards me like my entire life. That's really only something a woman, I don't want you telling me, Jason, or anybody else. It's the woman's experience. So how do you get these, do they admit that there was a war on drugs and that we really hurt a lot of people, and that the people that were hurt really do deserve a seat at the table and to be told, or do they just brush it off?
We get both, right? There are definitely folks that just downplay that anything bad has even happened. We also get folks that think we should lock people up for drinking booze too. And the kids that get in trouble for taking oxycodone, they should go to jail too. And so those people definitely exist, right? And I have to approach them with an effort to change the laws, right? And whether I agree with where they're at is less important than me pushing them closer to where I want them to be. And so the folks that are very overtly sort of just anti-drug in society is actually an easier conversation, right? I can have a more scientific conversation with them, honestly. It's the people that say, oh, I totally understand what you're saying. You're totally right. We'll do everything for you. And then don't put it in the policy. That is the difficult situation for me as an advocate. And that's the situation we're in with the governor's bill. They will say the word equity 1,000 times. But when I ask them to point to the bill number, what line item in this bill is the equity program, say, well, we were going to figure it out later. And they literally, so I served on the governor's working group and I chaired the licensing committee section. And just the same day on Wednesday when we were on NPR, they claimed that group didn't give them the recommendations on time. And like, it's really hard for me to go back in a room with that particular person and take them seriously that, oh, the conversation we're having now they're taking it seriously. But 3 months ago, they're going to throw me under the bus, even though I did most of the work for them. So that's actually more difficult for me. It is the, as MLK said, white moderate that claims I'm correct, but I need to wait. And so we're in that situation right now where it's like, well, we'll figure out the equity later and all this. The difference I think happened in Connecticut was we were ready for that. We had champions that were not going to play that game, and we came correct with the expertise and the policy, right? Like I was able to work with Robin Porter to introduce an alternative bill that had a definition of equity. So when they say, oh, we couldn't come up with a definition, that's why we didn't do it. It's like there's already one in the legislature right now. Just copy Robin's. And so we're trying to run them out of excuses. They find more all the time. But I will say that is much more of a difficult situation, one that is harder for me to really get at the root of than outward opposition.
Thank you for that, Jason. Great question,
Yes,
Martha.
thank you.
Next person we have online here is Ms. Renda. Will you please unmute yourself?
I've been a pharmacist in a medical marijuana dispensary for 6 years here in Connecticut. And I would love to connect with you to help you in your efforts if it'll help at all. So my email is just lzarenda@yahoo. If you, ever want to reach out, if there's anything I can do to talk to legislators or anything to help. One thing I wanted to touch on when Kate asked about gateway drug, because when I came into medical marijuana, I knew nothing. I wasn't a marijuana smoker. I would have been voted least likely to sell marijuana in high school. I had nothing to do with it, but I learned so much. And I would go on these visits with Dr. Sounder, who's on the Board of Physicians, who helps to choose which medical conditions are allowed to be used, cannabis is allowed to be used for in Connecticut. He had a slide about addiction. And on his slide, it listed the most addictive, products in the world and down to the least. And cannabis fell below caffeine on his list. And so people have a lot of misconceptions about that. And they need to understand that. I've talked to so many patients in the store and I've asked them, they'll come in and they'll say, I've been smoking for 20 years, but now I'm finally legal, and they're happy. And I've asked them, do you feel addicted? And they'll say no. They don't have withdrawal like you would if you're trying to come off an opiate. And another thing I wanted to touch on too about when you talked about gateway drug is I don't think the drug's a gateway drug. I think it's the drug dealers that open the gate. You know, people are buying illegal marijuana on the street, and then they're introduced to a drug dealer who's going to obviously want to get them using other stuff too. So I feel like the gateway thing's a total misconception. And even addiction, it's such a lower percentage than people think. And but I think legalization would stop that illegal market. There's people dying because stuff is laced with fentanyl that they're buying from. If they can go and buy it in a store where it's a product that's been tested and safe. And that's what I think the legislators need to understand. Because if you have safe tested products, no one's going to get hurt by those products because cannabis isn't toxic. You can't overdose on it. So I just think the legislators need to understand that too.
Sounds like you found a soulmate there, Jason. Sounds like you guys could do good work together.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And we will definitely connect. And Jason, you give me the contact info after this. The one piece that I will disagree a little bit on is the demonization of drug dealers. So when we talk about folks going to get cannabis, yes, there are people that sell other drugs. 99.99% of cannabis dealers do not. Most of the drug dealers are other kids at school that think it's cool or want to make more money or are doing it for financial reasons. And the folks that are selling cannabis in East Lyme and Waterford and New London are people that live in East Lyme and Waterford and London. And so I think when we look at drug dealers as these evil people that live somewhere else and they want to hurt our kids, that's just not the accurate picture of how students, especially young people, are accessing cannabis. Most people get it from a friend. And so I don't want us to look at the people that sell cannabis as these bad, evil people that we need to figure out how we're going to solve them being a part of our community. Most of the time, folks that sell cannabis would love to do it legally, would love to get it tested, would love to open up a shop, but they can't because it's illegal. And so if we were to give folks that option, it would have a very different dynamic. And I think if you even look at who's getting in trouble in high schools, right, it's not always the bad kids, right? This is something that affects all kinds of families and all kinds of different places. And the issue around selling drugs primarily is an economic one. Primarily, not always. Some folks sell cannabis because it's cool, because it's illegal and things like that. But when we talk about folks that are really selling, it's because they're trying to pay their bills, they're trying to make money, and they probably don't have a lot of other opportunities or options out there to do that in a legal way. And this is how it ends up. As we start to talk about criminal justice and the ways that drugs have become part of our communities and the ways that the criminal justice system concentrates certain problems in particular areas, we are more likely, if you were to arrest every single drug dealer that sold anything more than cannabis tomorrow, every single one of them will be replaced by somebody else because it's an economic thing, right? It is not a malice thing that these people want to hurt people. It is about money. And so we can't not talk about social justice without economic justice being part of the conversation, because there are thousands of people, white, black, brown, that are paying rent, they're paying their car bills, they're putting kids through college with cannabis money. If those folks are not included in the process of peacemaking, of ending the war on drugs, they will still have those financial issues that they have to address. And it's through the cannabis industry we can address some of them. But we can't do it if we look at the people currently in the illicit market as a problem. We have to look at them as partners in solving the problems.
Great perspective, Jason. Thank you very much for that. Friends, we're just about rounding out our presentation this evening. We have one more question from Mr. Tony Adanasio. Will you please unmute yourself, and you have the final word before Jason says his final piece, I guess.
Still muted, Tony. Oh, there you go.
Oh,
There you go.
We hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. There are 90 Democrats in the General Assembly.
In the House.
In the House, yes. Just that. So there should be some margin there. You wouldn't think this to be that. I'm just curious, in general terms, is it the particular bill, or where are these people from? I'm talking about the Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I know about our Republicans here, and I don't want to talk about that. What's the deal? I don't know how to ask this question.
Sure, yeah, and it's so it's been a very bizarre session, because when I say, who is opposed to this, right? Like, I don't get a clear answer. They'll say moderate Democrats, right? Like, can you give me names, right? And so I don't know, right, is the short answer to that. There are lots of different reasons. So how you do the count really depends on how you frame the question, right? So for example, Robin Porter is listed as a maybe on most voting whip votes, whip lists, because it has to have equity in it. Now that is not a no, right? Like that is something that make it better and I'm on board. So how many of those votes, whenever someone does a whip count, are that, right? Which is very different than someone that says, I don't want legalization to happen at all. I think it's a bad idea, right? And so when we look at who the 76 are, who are the 16 or 14 that we can lose, you know, that I think is getting confused as people are asking different questions of those 90 people and getting different numbers. And, you know, because part of the problem with that is the political, if we ask, let's say, how do you feel about Robin's bill? And she gets 80 people say yes. And we ask, how many people feel about the governor's bill? He gets 60 people to say yes. Now Robin is in charge of the conversation. That means the governor's folks are not going to ask that question and don't want to ask the question on Robin's bill, right? Because the numbers have come out wrong. And so the only time that I can get a truthful answer on that, right, is if I personally, right, I have Robin or myself ask on her bill as it stands right now, right? And then also say, what amendments would it take to bring you over? So there's about a lot of work there, but it's something leadership should be able to do. And I am very confused as to who exactly are the no votes. I know there's a handful of them in the Black and Puerto Rican caucus, and we have a lot of work to do there. We are working with the NAACP to start to get folks to really institutionally support, and now is the time to do this, which I think those concerns often are faith-based, and it's just their religion. They don't believe that you should be doing that to your body, and so it's a bit tricky to try to get them to come over. Some folks have very personal histories when it comes to drug or drug use that they'll never support, you know, legalizing, even if, you know, I believe it would benefit those folks, they may not. And then there are some folks that just are worried about, you know, how is their suburban town going to think of their vote down the road? And so it's a mix, I would imagine. The issue, though, is that there's like no clarity as to who are these people, how many of each of these groups exist. You know, we're not really sure. So for me, I have to go down the list, right, with started leadership and just like every time there's a committee meeting, who on this committee needs to move this one step forward. But every time the bill changes, the vote changes, right? And we want Lamont to change his bill and make it better. But I can't tell you if he makes it better in my eyes, will he lose votes in Ansonia or somewhere, right? Like that's only leadership really knows the details and what do they want to accomplish. And then lastly, I'll say, I'm sure there are folks that made promises to various entities in their community or, you know, in the industry and are going to stick to those promises no matter what the right decision is.
Well, it sounds like you have your work cut out for you, Jason, but we really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with all of us here. It's very informative.
It's a pleasure. And happy to continue with other forums. Like the way we're going to get this done is to talk to people, you know, make sure we address real specific concerns, talk with honesty, but meet people where they're at, right? There are folks that are not with us yet. Let's bring them there. The folks that are with us and want to get involved, you know, have them contact us through PureCT, or I put my email on the bottom here because it's going to take a village to make this happen. But I think we have the talent and the people and the support of the public to do it the right way this year.
Well, I hope for the health and vitality of our communities that this happens, and we're willing to support you all the way. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we say goodbye, I want to thank Jason for taking time out and being an electrifying and enthusiastic speaker. I want to thank Kate for her questions and fielding the questions from the chat. She did a great job. And I would like to also once again invite you all to our next DTC community conversation here in East Lyme. It will be on April 22nd, which is Earth Day, with Rosemary Ostfeld, a PhD in environmental science, and a local business owner. So if you are interested in the environment and talking about how it is being affected here in East Lyme, please check that out.
She teaches at Wesleyan, doesn't she?
She does teach at Wesleyan. Thank you, Mr.
So a real quick point on environmental justice. Robin's
Go for it.
the only bill that has any sort of environmental justice provisions in it, and it does create a grant structure to rehabilitate old buildings to use as economic opportunity centers. So if you're interested in environmental justice, support Robin's bill.
Great plug. Also, friends, we are going to have a regularly scheduled East Lyme DTC meeting over Zoom next Thursday. So 1 week from today, if you are interested in stopping by there, open to the public, you can find out the link on our website, which is eastlinedemocrats.org. Forgive me for the shameless plug, everybody, but that's what I do. And once again, I wanted to say thank you to Jason, Kate. Jason, do you have any final words before we get out of here?
Just get involved, get reps to co-sponsor. This is the whole Eastern Connecticut can benefit. We have lots of different ways that I can explain in details, like direct sales tax that will help any city that does open up a cannabis establishment. So literally every community can benefit, but we need leadership from all communities, not just urban, really talking about how this benefits them. And so please do talk to folks in your neighborhoods, in your school systems, and ask, how will legalization benefit us, and how can we send the legislators policy that makes sense for us?
All right, great. Thank you very much, Jason. I'm going to stop recording and say goodbye to everyone. Thanks so much, everyone. See you around.